If you have $1 million saved for retirement, the standard advice says something simple. Live off the dividends. Let the fund send you a check every quarter and never touch the shares underneath it. In 2026, that quiet plan can cost a retired couple more than $12,000 a year in taxes and lost growth they never see on a statement. The financial industry loves selling income funds because they feel safe. They feel like a paycheck you can count on. What nobody puts in the brochure is that forcing a dividend is often the least efficient way to get paid, and it hands your tax bill to a fund manager you have never met. I've watched people sit on a portfolio for years, terrified to sell a single share, while inflation quietly ate into what that money could actually buy. It is not laziness. It is loyalty to a rule that made sense decades ago and stopped making sense somewhere along the way. Today I want to walk you through what I call the boring paycheck strategy. It is a way to build your own dividend on purpose, instead of letting a fund choose one for you. Done right, it can lower your effective tax rate by 15% or more, while your principal keeps compounding underneath it. Most people are afraid to try this because it means selling shares, and selling feels like spending down the nest egg you spent 30 years building. I understand that fear, so I am going to show you the math that proves selling a share on your own terms is actually safer than waiting for someone else to mail you a check, plus the simple spending bucket habit that makes it feel just as automatic as a paycheck ever did. In 2026, if you are a married couple earning $120,000 a year in total income, every dollar of non-qualified dividends from a high-yield fund gets taxed at your ordinary income rate. For most people in that bracket, that is 22%. Long-term capital gains from selling shares you already own can be taxed at 0% or 15%, depending on where your income lands. Stop and think about that for a second. You didn't choose to take a distribution. The fund chose it for you, and the tax bill showed up anyway. Most retirees chase yield inside a regular brokerage account, not a retirement account. If you hold a covered call fund or a high-yield bond fund there, the IRS treats every dividend as income the moment it lands, whether you need the cash that month or not. You get taxed on money you never asked to receive. Multiply that across 20 or 25 years of retirement, and the gap between the two approaches stops being a rounding error. It starts looking like a second retirement account you saved for, but never actually got to use. This is not about being greedy. It's about protecting the life you built as a provider. Instead of handing the IRS a 20% convenience fee, just because you wanted a check to show up automatically. Think about your own bills for a second. Your mortgage, your insurance, your property tax bill, none of them arrive on the fund's schedule. They arrive on your schedule. When your income is forced by a dividend payment, instead of built around what you actually owe that month, you end up paying tax on cash flow you didn't design. Every year a fund forces a taxable payout you didn't need, you are quietly paying rent on money that was already yours. And every dollar taxed away this year is a dollar that stops compounding for the rest of your retirement. Picture two versions of the same $1 million portfolio, both paying out $50,000 a year. In the dividend version, the entire amount is taxed as income, and you lose $11,000 to the IRS. In the selling version, most of that money is your own principal coming back to you, so you only owe capital gains tax on the sliver that is real growth, closer to $1,500. That is roughly $9,500 staying in your pocket instead of getting sent to Washington. I know what you are thinking. If you keep selling shares, eventually you run out of shares. That is the biggest myth going around in retirement planning, and it is exactly what we are taking apart next. Here is the framework I want you to walk away with today. Instead of staring at your brokerage account every month and agonizing over which shares to sell, you build what I call an automatic spending account. You set it up once, and then you barely think about it. Every 90 days, you sell a fixed slice of your portfolio, something like 1% for every 4% you plan to spend a year, and you move that money into a completely separate, high-yield savings account. That account becomes your paycheck bucket. It is the only account you touch for groceries, gas, and everything else. I used to think dividends were the gold standard for retirees. I told my own parents to look for what people call dividend aristocrats, companies that raise their payout every year like clockwork. But after watching how much growth they gave up chasing that yield, and how much of it got taxed away before it ever reached their pocket, I changed my mind. The math of total return simply wins. Here is why the bucket matters more than the mechanics. When your spending money sits in its own account, separate from your investments, the emotional tie to your share count breaks. You are not selling your nest egg to buy groceries. You are transferring money that already left the portfolio 3 months ago and has been sitting there waiting for you. Ask yourself honestly, does watching your account balance every day actually make you feel safer? Or does it just make you feel like you are guarding something you are afraid to spend? Automating the transfer also removes a decision you would otherwise have to make every quarter for the rest of your life. That is one less financial choice competing for your attention when you would rather spend that energy on your grandkids, your garden, or just a quiet afternoon. The old dividend-only approach looks passive, but it quietly locks you into whatever a fund manager decides to pay, in whatever account happens to hold it, whether or not that matches what you actually need that quarter. There is a practical reason to do this quarterly instead of once a year. Selling a little at a time smooths out the price you get. If the market dips the week you would have sold everything at once, a quarterly rhythm means only 1 quarter's worth of shares get sold at that lower price, not your whole year's spending money. The shares you haven't sold yet keep doing their job. If your portfolio is invested broadly, something tracking the S&P 500, for instance, that unsold portion keeps compounding in the background while your paycheck bucket handles the bills. Imagine your car insurance bill landing in October and your property tax bill landing in December. Your paycheck bucket does not care which month it is. The quarterly harvest already filled it, so you are never scrambling to sell shares at a bad moment just because a bill showed up. If you spent 30 years building this nest egg, and you are tired of feeling like the IRS is a silent, expensive partner in your retirement, subscribe. We focus on the math that keeps more of your money in your pocket, not the fund companies. In 2026, there is a tool built specifically for people your age. It's called the Additional Senior Deduction, and it came out of the legislation people have started calling the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. If you are 65 or older, you get an extra $6,000 deduction on top of your standard deduction. A married couple who are both 65 or older get $12,000 combined. That is real money that lowers what the IRS can touch before it ever calculates your tax bill. That $6,000 deduction is not unlimited either. It starts to phase out once your income passes $75,000 for a single filer, or $150,000 for a married couple filing together. So the same quarterly harvest that lowers your tax bill on the sale itself can also help you stay under that line and keep the whole deduction intact. Think of it like a coupon that disappears the moment your total crosses a certain line. You don't lose it all at once, but every dollar over the threshold chips away at what you get to keep. Here is where the boring paycheck strategy earns its keep. By creating your own dividend through selling shares, instead of collecting forced income from dividends and interest, you have more control over your modified adjusted gross income, the number that determines how much of this deduction you actually get to keep. This matters because of something people call the tax torpedo. Push your income too high, and up to 85% of your Social Security becomes taxable. Push it higher still, and your Medicare Part B premium jumps too. Standard Part B costs $202.90 a month in 2026. Cross the wrong income threshold, and that same premium can climb to $689.90, more than $400 higher, for a mistake most people don't realize they made until the letter from Medicare shows up. For a couple where both spouses cross that line, the hit lands twice, once on each Medicare bill. Controlling your income is not just about April's tax return. It is about preventing a jump in what you pay for health care every single month for the rest of the year. Nobody tells you that a decision at 63 can quietly set your health care costs at 65. That's not a guess. That's how the IRMAA look-back actually works. None of this only lives on paper. It is the same discipline that helps you survive when the market does not cooperate, which is exactly what we need to stress test next. Let's stress test this. Imagine the market drops 15% sometime in year 2 of your retirement. That is not rare. That is closer to normal. Picture the person relying entirely on a high dividend fund for income. During a real crash, plenty of companies cut their dividends. That happened broadly in 2008 and again in 2020. Their paycheck shrinks at the exact moment they need it most, and it forces them to sell even more shares at the worst possible price just to cover the gap. Dividend cuts are not some company being cruel. They happen because a board of directors is protecting cash during a downturn, and paying you was never their first obligation. Depending on someone else's board meeting to fund your grocery bill is a fragile plan, no matter how boring it looks in a good year. Now think about the boring strategist instead. They keep 24 months of spending sitting in a money market fund, separate from the invested portfolio entirely. When the market drops, they simply stop the quarterly harvest from stocks and live off that buffer instead. No panic selling, no decisions made out of fear. Here's why that buffer size matters. During the 2008 crisis, the S&P 500 took as long as 410 trading days, close to a year and a half, to climb back to where it started, according to Hartford Funds. A 24-month buffer plus whatever dividends keep coming in covers almost that entire recovery window without ever forcing you to sell at the bottom. 2 years is not an arbitrary number either. Most downturns that hit retirees hard have resolved well inside that window, which is exactly why the buffer is sized to outlast the storm rather than to guess when it will end. Ask yourself, honestly, what you would actually do if your account dropped 15% next quarter. Would you keep selling on schedule, or would fear make the decision for you? If the honest answer is panic, that tells you exactly where your buffer needs to sit, before the drop happens, not after it. A boring plan that survives a bad year beats an exciting one that doesn't. This sounds great if you are sitting on $2 million. But what if most of what you have is in a single 401k? That is exactly where most people get stuck, and it is where we are headed next. Meet Gary. He's 62. He does not have $2 million sitting in a diversified brokerage account. He has $550,000 and every dollar of it sits inside a traditional 401k. Gary cannot do the asset location move from earlier because he only has one bucket. Every single withdrawal from that account gets taxed as ordinary income, whether it came from growth or from money he put in himself 20 years ago. I've seen people do this without realizing what it costs them. They treat their entire 401k like one big pile of the same kind of money, when the IRS treats every withdrawal exactly the same way, as income, taxed the year it comes out. Tax brackets are not about how much you have. They are about how much shows up as income in a single year. Gary's balance doesn't change the day he retires, but his taxable income drops sharply the moment his paycheck stops, and that gap is the whole opportunity. Gary's lever is what's called a Roth conversion bridge. He retires at 62, but waits until 70 to start Social Security. In those 8 years, his income is unusually low, since he has no paycheck and no benefit check yet. During that window, Gary converts $40,000 a year from his 401k into a Roth IRA. He pays tax on that $40,000 now, while his income and his tax bracket are both low, instead of later, when required minimum distributions force much larger withdrawals at a potentially higher rate. Most people never get a second run at low-income years like this. Once required minimum distributions start, or once Social Security begins, that window closes, and the same $40,000 conversion suddenly costs more in tax than it would have during those quiet years in between. It's the same logic as paying a big bill early, during a month when your other expenses happen to be low, instead of waiting until December when the mortgage, the insurance, and the holidays all land at once. By 73, when required minimum distributions kick in, Gary has shrunk his traditional 401k enough that the forced withdrawals do not push him into a higher bracket, and they do not trigger the Medicare premium jump we talked about earlier. None of this means Gary did something wrong by keeping everything in one account for 30 years. That is what his employer offered, and he used it exactly the way he was told to. This is the next step, not a correction of a mistake. But there is one thing that stops Gary, and probably stops you too, from actually doing this, and it has nothing to do with the math. There is a name for what stops Gary, and it's not laziness or fear exactly. Psychologists call it loss aversion, and a close cousin of it called the endowment effect. In plain terms, we value the shares we already own more than the cash they could become. It makes sense that selling feels wrong. You spent decades being told to save and save and save some more, and every dollar you didn't spend felt like proof you were doing it right. Even spending money that is entirely yours, can feel like failing at the one job you trained for your whole adult life. That feeling is normal, and it does not mean you are doing this wrong. Try thinking of your portfolio less like a flock of chickens you are afraid to lose, and more like an apple orchard. A dividend is an apple that falls off the tree whenever the tree decides to drop it, bruised or small, on its own schedule. Selling a share is you reaching up and picking the best apple when you are actually hungry. Picking one apple does not kill the tree. Picking apples is the entire reason you planted the orchard in the first place. This shift is not about becoming reckless with money you worked hard for. It's about matching the account to the job. The orchard's job is to grow. The bucket's job is to pay your bills. Confusing the two is what keeps people stuck. You don't have to overhaul everything this month. Start by automating just one quarterly transfer. Then stop watching your share count every day. Watch your paycheck bucket balance instead. That's the number that actually tells you whether your retirement is working. It takes practice, not perfection. and nobody gets the rhythm right on the first quarter. Retirement was never really about how much yield you could squeeze out of a portfolio. It's about how much spendable life you can pull out of it with the least amount of friction along the way. You already did the hard part. You saved for decades, you showed up for work through good years and bad, and you built the number that got you to this point. Now let the boring math, the quarterly harvest, the separate bucket, the low-income years, do the harder work of actually paying you back. None of this needed to be exciting to work. It just needed to be repeated, quarter after quarter, without much drama at all. If you want the specific 2026 tax bracket breakdown, to see whether you qualify for that 0% capital gains rate, subscribe and keep an eye out for the next video on the tax-free bridge. I'm Wes, and I'll see you in the next one.